I'm John Wunsch, and Ken asked me to come in here and speak a little bit about PDR. So there are so many things that could be said about it. For me, the most interesting feature really is the way the idea came to the community from different directions and the way the idea was evolved by the community. For my own part, I was a touring musician in the 80s and I was away from the area. And while on tour, ended up performing in some areas that had preservation programs. So I heard about it and thought, well, that's pretty cool. Maybe that would be a tool back at Old Mission. I know that one of the strongest early proponents was Walter Johnson, who had heard about it from his daughter who was living out in Long Island where there was a program. So the idea had come through that source. Another interesting anecdote, and probably something that's been heard from other mouths than mine, is that I remember Rob Manigault saying his first day on the job as a township supervisor, or perhaps it was the first day that Gordon Hayward came on the job while he was supervisor. When they first met, the first thing that both of them wanted to talk about was the PDR. So those are a few examples of different ways that the same idea was floating around. And when it was first being discussed here in the late 80s, it was indeed pretty cutting edge and new. By the time I moved back home in 1990, I was not necessarily aware of anybody else talking about it here, but put myself out there as a volunteer to help with something along those lines, and found that the word was already out. People were already discussing it. My personal experience with the program is that I had the good fortune of getting involved early and ending up as the citizen chair for the process of representing ideas from the community, and then later ended up chairing the campaign process. And for me, one of the things that also leads up to this that is historically important is to realize that up through the 1950s and 1960s, farming was not being thought of as potentially under threat from development. But in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, there was some knowledge-based building in the development community that this would be a good area to try to put more homes. And some farms were beginning to be sold off to developers who would eventually want to develop it. And so when I left the area in the early 70s to go away to college, I knew of a number of properties that were already under ownership by development groups. But they were still being farmed until the development groups had paid for the land. So at the point that I left, the feeling was that, wow, we were going to lose a lot of this farmland. And personally, I didn't expect the core of the farmland to hold together much longer. So to return in 1990 and found that the core of the farmland had held together, that the evolution of the economic forces had been such that development had not been able to proceed. A number of these farms, many of these farms, were back in the hands of the original or new farmers, and so we did have the opportunity still. And that was my main inspiration to want to say that I wanted to get involved. That was my main reason to say, if 20 years later I came back here and these farms are still here and the opportunity exists, I really want to do something about it. Also important in my being interested is that my family had been farming here a long time. I'd worked on the farms from the time I was quite young, and up until my mid-late 30s still was working actively on the farms. So it's something my heart was already drawn to. Again, I guess the purpose we're here is to give more historical perspective, so I should try to talk a bit about the process. And what happened in the process of setting the program up was that governmental members and some citizens were interested in it and brought it to the town board, and the town board rejected it. So at that point, it was incumbent upon citizens to persuade the town board. So we started study groups. We looked very closely at how the financing could work. We did an intensive research process which put us in contact with farmers, governmental members, and community members at large in each of the communities that already had a program around the country. And we took all the knowledge we could get there, put together a report. We put together a blue ribbon panel of financial experts with really strong backgrounds in finances, and looked at all of the detailed implications and the best possible projections of what would happen. We polled the community, we went out and spoke in the community, and came back to the town board about 9 months later. And we were in touch with them every month or two. We'd come in and say, well, this is what we found so far, and this is what we're working on. And took it out of the arena of something that was brought by process of a planning commission, subcommittees bringing to the planning commission, bringing to the board. And having been rejected at that point, took it out and said, okay, let's get it down to a grassroots level process and really involve people and really do the research and come back to the board as a purely citizen-driven group. At the point we finally came back to the board, they were willing to back it, and some of them reluctantly flat out said, I don't think this is a great thing. I don't want to see tax dollars used for this purpose, but it's clear that enough people have worked on it that we have to give the people the chance. And that was the key argument, is don't try to be a parent to your community and take away the opportunity for us to vote, for us to make our own decision. That backed up with all the evident work that had gone in and the information from the research persuaded the board to let us take it to a vote. The campaign started in June of the year that we had the first PDR vote. I'm sorry I haven't done much research at the moment, but I believe that would be 94, but I'm sure that in the process of editing this together we'll get that nailed down. So in June of the year of the vote, we started with informational flyers. We continued that process with a very large, detailed brochure. We followed up then with a lot of talking around the community in settings at church groups or at conservancy groups, historical groups, open meetings to the public, announced them, did some interviewing for the TV shows, for the local news programming, and worked very hard to get the word out. Had an intensive door-to-door campaign, well organized, with a lot of support. The people who were behind this believed in it passionately. I think the initial polls were pretty well below 50% on support on this. In the end, we did have a successful vote. We won by over 50%. So we were able to move the needle far enough with that campaign. It took a lot of people. It did not take a lot of money. It was a very inexpensive campaign. There were a few paid ads in the newspaper toward the end, and there was the cost of the flyers. But at that time, in the early 90s, that was not a prodigious amount of money. It was the idea that got it through. It was really, I think, a combination of novelty, creativity, and a true heartfelt desire by the community to see farms continue. And another interesting feature of this is that it was the non-farming community that had to step up and vote to support it to get it through. Your farming community is a relatively small number compared to the overall population. An interesting flip side of that is that the farming community would not have been able to vote it down either. But no one in the farming community was required to enter the program. Everyone in the community was going to be paying taxes on it. So a vote of the entire community was what was called for, and it succeeded. Also, interestingly enough, was the evolution after that. Because there was a second campaign about 8 years later, and that second campaign passed by a far wider margin. The second campaign, to my recollection, was over 60%. And so you saw that over the years we had the program, it was understood better and better and became more and more popular. So it was a resounding victory the second time. The other evidence of the success of the program is that in the farming community, a number of people who had opposed it initially, once they saw it in action, ended up actually applying, and now a number of their farms are in the program. So it took some portion of the community to pass it, but it took the program itself to persuade a far larger number of members of the community and to persuade resistant members of the farming community that it was indeed a good idea. And I'm not going to try to spout figures because I didn't do research before this interview. However, the large picture is it's been successful. It has stabilized the farming community. It gave an opportunity for a lot of farms to pass into new ownership, to pass generationally through the family without the questions of needing to go into development to take care of the financial obligations of the current owners. So in my mind, it's successful in that it has stabilized a resource. And that is a feature of the justification for the program that supersedes any particular industry. To have gone in and said, we're going to have a cherry industry always, and we need to preserve this land for that cherry industry, would have certainly at the time been a very tough sell, and perhaps one that could not, in all honesty, be made. But to make the argument instead, which is, I think, undeniable, that the combination of climate, geography, soil type makes this land eminently valuable for any number of agricultural products is an argument you can make. And we see that now in that we've evolved to having a significant grape industry. Cherries have continued and are still successful. Apples are still grown well here. Basically any stone fruit is going to do very well here. And the percentage of arable land in this country that is suitable for stone fruit is minimal. It's a few percent. So that's an argument that was used and is accurate and is playing out effectively. And in fact, at this point, sitting here in 2011, what many of us argued has come to pass in that this agricultural land is now becoming more and more valuable. It is now selling for prices as agricultural land that would have been unheard of at the time. So the argument that the land is valuable, the argument that it will be used for one product or another, and that again, I didn't mention this before, but now hops. That's a whole new product and crop that is taking fire here. So the argument that it will be used for some product or some crop is being played out with full force. Speaking a little historically about some other things besides the PDR that may be of some interest, I can't say that my knowledge base is broad and deep. I think we've got some older members of the community that will provide a lot more. But an interesting story that I'm aware of is related to the one-room schoolhouses and the consolidation. My uncle Alice Wunsch was the founding superintendent of, or was the superintendent of this one-room schoolhouses at the time, and founded the program, or was in the position as the superintendent when consolidation came on. He was a proponent of consolidation. And one of the very interesting things is that our Old Mission School is in a beautiful location now. It's on the top of a hill with wonderful views. It is on what is considered very good fruit land. And at the time, the community became quite divided over using such fine fruit land for a school. And there were some who were quite passionate that this was foolhardy and unnecessary. Schools should be down on low land that is not good land for farming. You're wasting that land for this use. Anyone who's gone to school there, including myself, would have to argue that that was a brilliant use of the land. And that's a case where the division in the community was deep and difficult at the time. But fortunately, the choice was made to put the school there. Other than that, another interesting feature of the community's background, I'm sure that there have been other people speaking to this, but earlier in this century, a lot of the people coming into the area were former tourists becoming resorters. They'd maybe toured in the area and now were settling in. And one of the fun stories for me is that initially my grandfather was a lawyer and purchased our family's farm for someplace that some of the family could go to get away from the city. And so in the early years, they were up here just in the summer, and he would come up on the train every Friday and go back every Sunday night. And so he'd work down to Detroit, and the family would be up here. And it's great to remember the stories that my mother and father told of how when they'd come up here, they still had an ice house, and they'd be pulling ice up and putting it in their ice box to keep their food cold. Everything was lit only by kerosene. There was a hand crank phone in the farmhouse, and they liked to, well, two things went on. Each of the boys had the opportunity of the three brothers to, in effect, run the farm in the summer. Now, there was a very experienced tenant hand who was actually looking right over their shoulder, making sure they did it well. But they would come up here and work on the farm, but they also had a great passion for sailing. So great stories of my grandmother having to take the kerosene lamps down to the shore and put them on the shore, so when they come back in from sailing up from Traverse City, that they could find where the farmhouse was. So I'm blessed to have a vision of the area before electricity, and of these farms early on that is in my memory. And that farmhouse is still in our family, and of course now by 15, 20 years after my grandfather purchased that, one of my uncles settled here and started farming, and then his son took over that farm, and now his son and daughter are running that farm, and I own some farmland. And so we've really become a part of the farming community, but in our case it started as a resort area. And that ties a little bit into the PDR in that it was very interesting that some of the biggest, let me put it a different way, some of the most enthusiastic volunteers were resorters, and disproportionately owning shore property, they pay a higher tax. So some of the people who really wanted to see that PDR were people who were really resorters and were paying a disproportionately high tax, but they really believed in it and supported it, and that was a valuable asset, and an interesting way that the non-farming community and even the non-residential community has been a force in shaping the future of Old Mission. Some in the case like my family, which started out here as resorters and became deeply entrenched in the farming community. Others in the case of resorters who are still resorters, who do everything they can to support preserving farmland and other lands out here. A purchase of development rights program recognizes that land has different values. We're all familiar with the idea that there are mineral rights. That's something that's different from the right to sit and live on the surface. Put that together with understanding what an easement is. Most people are familiar with the fact that a power company may have an easement that allows them to run a power line over your property. They've been granted that legally. It's on the title. You can't do anything about it. Same with a road easement. You buy a piece of property, a 20-acre piece of property, and a road cuts across a third of it to go from a main road to a farm. Well, that was written onto that deed and agreed to by a previous owner. It runs with the property. So with a purchase of development rights program, you take those two understandable rights and put them together, and you say, okay, the right to build a house on the land is different from the right to farm that land. And so a current owner could write an easement onto that property saying, no houses can ever be built here. They are, in effect, extinguishing the right to build a house or the right to develop the property. In a PDR, or Purchase of Development Rights program, we are going to a landowner and offering if they would like to sell the right to build on the property and be assured thereby that that land will never be developed. They have the right to just, without being paid, put it on the deed. But that's a value that is part of what they hold. It'd be like if someone held some stocks, and these stocks were worth X amount of money. And if they were extremely wealthy, they might donate those stocks to a nonprofit, but most people, they've saved all their life to have that. It's part of what they're going to count on to live out their years. And so to give that away is not reasonable. Well, a farm is a business that either for purposes of eventual retirement in some cases, or for purposes of selling the land for a proportionate increase in value from what they paid for it, they really can't afford to just give that away. So in this case,